So the biggest challenge for France after the end of the Second World War was simply rebuilding the country. In many ways, France was, at least in physical terms, much more badly damaged during the Second World War than the First World War. Obviously, during the First World War, it was in terms of population that the French nation had suffered its greatest losses with the staggering loss of life on the Western Front. Comparatively, the Second World War wasn't quite as devastating in terms of civilian loss. So in total, about 600,000 French people died during the course of the war related to issues with the war. 2/3 of them were civilians who were killed either by the Nazi invasion or some form of Nazi attack during the war. But 600,000 was less than half of the casualties the French suffered compared to the First World War. But economically and physically, France was much more badly damaged. So just for a figure of comparison, after the First World War, 18 of France's departments were classified as having been significantly damaged. And of course, those were primarily the departments in the north and east of France that had been occupied by Germany during the First World War. After the Second World War, that was 74 departments were classified as having been severely damaged during the war. And this was due to a variety of factors. Sometimes simply the Germans just destroying buildings or destroying the infrastructure for their own ends. It was partly due to the activities of the resistance in trying to undermine the German war effort. And of course, the Allies also significantly bombed France at different times during the Second World War in order to try and defeat the Germans there as well. So France, in terms of its infrastructure, was very badly damaged. And this obviously had a very negative knock-on effect for the French economy as well. So by the end of 1944, the level of industrial output in France was only about 38% of what it had been in 1938. So there was a significant economic drop-off in France. There had been an effort to quickly restore wages to people. Wages that had been reduced or suppressed during the Nazi occupation. But that actually only led to inflation. So France economically was struggling quite badly in the wake of the Second World War. It needed to rebuild much of its economy, much of its physical infrastructure, but it also had issues in terms of trying to provide decent wages for the people of France. And one of the key figures of the new government who was involved in planning for how to improve the French economy was a guy, Jean Monnet, who had spent much of the Second World War actually in the United States. He was very impressed at the role of the American government in taking control of the American economy during the war. He had studied at Harvard for a time as well, and was determined to bring back some of the new ideas he had learned in the United States and apply them to France as well. So Monnet publishes the Monnet Plan in 1946, outlining how France is going to plan for the future, how it's going to develop economically. He held off proposing a kind of a command-style economy as was advocated by the Soviet Union. Monnet believed much more there was more significant gains could be made if there was a close cooperation between the government and large French industries that were still privately run. Although, as we'll see, the government was not afraid to nationalise industries either. And it also planned that in future the French economy would be much more self-sufficient than it had been prior to the Second World War, in particular in terms of it being willing to compete on the global stage. He felt that French industry had been kind of sugarcoated is not the right word, had been kind of pampered by the French government by being protected by high protective walls. He felt that had undermined France's economic competitiveness. So he was very determined that in future France would look to compete economically with the wider world on an open free markets with a view to creating a stronger economy that wouldn't suffer from the failings of the French economy during the Third Republic. What this actually involved, though, it was also a wave of nationalizations in France in the wake of the First World War. At the beginning, this was kind of retributive nationalization, so companies that had collaborated with the Nazi regime were punished by essentially being taken over by the French government. Renault was the most famous example of this. But by the late 1940s, the French government had taken charge of other industries as well. So much of the insurance industry was controlled by the French government, the gas and electricity industry, and the public transport system in Paris as well had been taken over by the French government. So for Monnet's trying to create an economy that on the one hand, will kind of capitalize on the best aspects of capitalism and free market economy, but also is not afraid to use the government as a directing agent, especially in nationalizing industries, to promote an improvement as well. There was also the beginnings of a French welfare state starting in the late 1940s. This had been something that the United Kingdom had introduced in the wake of the end of the First World War, especially after the Labour government won power in 1945 in the United Kingdom. And France, to some extent, followed suit. The new French constitution had promised everyone a right to a job, a right to medical care, a right to education, a right to leisure time, and a right to protection and protection in old age as well. So this was essentially the beginnings of the French welfare state. Although the French system didn't exactly model the United Kingdom system, so when the French socialized healthcare system was introduced, the private industry, health industry, remained in existence as well. And so the French healthcare system was a mix of private and public that pretty much covered everyone, but also kind of made it more expensive to administer because it had to cater for the needs of private industry as well. And one of the criticisms of the French welfare system was that it tended to subsidize middle class families quite nicely. So middle class families who could perhaps afford to pay more did not have to. But by doing so, it also didn't kind of reduce social inequality between classes, as some of the welfare systems in the United Kingdom and in the Scandinavian countries did as well. So a key year for the development of the new Fourth Republic was in 1947. That was the stage by which the kind of unity of the liberation effort was starting to wear off, and the real policy differences between the various groups, the three parties, the Socialist, the Communist Party, and the Popular Republican movement governing France at the time, began to emerge. Of course, that was also the year that the Cold War was intensifying in terms of its grip on world politics, certainly on European politics, and it kind of put the French government in an awkward spot that it was kind of very reliant upon the United States for assistance in trying to develop its economy, and yet at the same time, the government has communist ministers in it, the enemies supposedly of, or those at least who were aligned with the Soviet Union and with Stalin. So in 1947, the Renault factory went on strike demanding higher wages. The French government was determined not to give in to grant higher wages because that was adding to the problem of inflation that was still devastating the French economy. The Communist Party, which was in government, along with the Socialist Party and the Popular Republican movement, felt that it could not vote against the interests of the workers in the plant. It refused to support the government's initiative, and as a result, they were kicked out of the government by the French Prime Minister Paul Ramadier. Now, he did it for reasons. He basically felt that if the French government or the Communist Party would not work with the French government, it should not remain within the government. But a lot of people on the left felt that this had been ordered by the American government for the French Communist Party to be kicked out of the government, which really wasn't true. I mean, the American government was kind of glad to see the French Communist Party sidelined from the levers of power in France, but it was not. It did not actively ask the French government to do this. And so what emerged, the government essentially rebranded itself as what it called a third force. It tried to present itself as a moderate, reasonably centrist alternative to the two growing kind of hardline right-wing and left-wing organizations. Obviously, on the left, the Communist Party represented the interests of the left, but on the right, de Gaulle had created his own new political party, what was called the Rally for the People of France. Obviously based around his personality, what was determined to fix the flaws of the Fourth Republic, and in particular to redo its constitution, to recreate a strong executive branch within the French political system. So the third force was presenting itself as a kind of a moderate central position between the Rally for the People of France and against the Communist Party as well. But what's interesting, of course, this meant by 1947 effectively that both the leader of the French resistance, at least the figurehead, Charles de Gaulle, and the party that participated most actively with the resistance, the Communist Party, were now kind of outside of government and remained on the outside for the foreseeable future. So de Gaulle's Rally for the People of France was very popular in 1947. It did succeed initially in winning a lot of support. The problem for de Gaulle was that the next elections were not due to be held until 1951, so for another 4 years. And by the time those elections actually came around, the Rally for the People of France didn't really succeed, or certainly didn't succeed in winning enough votes to form a government. And that, at the time, seemed to condemn de Gaulle to be a peripheral figure in French politics for the rest of his life. Although, as we'll see, that's not exactly what happened. Okay, speaking of economic development, so here's a Jeopardy question for you guys. This program, this helped restart European economies after World War II. An interesting statistic: cost less than 50% of American expenditure in Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. And the answer is, what is the Marshall Plan? So the Marshall Plan was introduced in 1947 in order to kickstart European economies for a couple of reasons. One was to simply prevent the spread of communism, to make communism more attractive. Another reason was, and this fact isn't often discussed as much in the United States, but very simply, American businesses needed rebooted European economies to be able to sell goods to as well. So with the aid, George Marshall recommended that the US government spend money on kickstarting the various economies of France or of Europe, and this was an enormous benefit to the French economy as well. So here we have a cartoon, American cartoon, in some ways sarcastically talking about the Marshall Plan, trying to revive the European economy, which the French obviously benefited from as well, obviously paid on by American taxpayers. But it's largely succeeded in helping France get on the road to recovery. So by 1950, almost all of the destroyed departments of France had been rebuilt. The French economy was beginning to take off once more. There was very clear green shoots that France was recovering. Workers were able to find employment again. The French industrial output exceeded what it had, what the level had reached in the late 1930s. Things still weren't necessarily perfect. French wages had not fully recovered to what they had been before the war, and so in order to kind of make up the difference, French workers had to oftentimes work very, very long hours. But by 1950, with the aid of the Marshall Plan, the French economy was in a much stronger place than it had been in the previous 4 or 5 years, and a lot of people were beginning to look optimistically to the future of a period of sustained economic growth in France.